Now that we've taken the visual input and organized it in some kind of stable shape, the next task is that to be able to recognize the identity of what we're looking at. And this is known as object recognition. Now, ultimately, object recognition must rely on some form of matching, whereby you take the input to your retina and you somehow match that, perhaps after a series of transformations, such as those we've spoken about so far, and you match that to something, some kind of representation that is already in your memory. And that would allow you to tell that the object you're looking at is object X. Take this example. It takes you an instant to recognize that is what is on the screen is a certain animal, in fact, a goat. And I could show you this, and you'd even be able to tell me that's the exact same goat. And it's interesting because you're viewing lines that are hitting your retina are different. They're smaller, and it's even in a different position with respect to the first goat, yet to the first image. Yet you have no hesitation in seeing the second image and saying that's exactly the same as the first. In fact, I could show you this and you'd still be able to tell me, yep, still a goat, same goat as before, even though you're actually seeing it upside down. And in fact, I can even show you this and it'll take you the same instant to look at it and say, still a goat, but different goat from the one before. And see, this exposes one of the crucial aspects of the recognition system. On the one hand, you want the system to be general enough that it allows you to recognize the same object when you view it under different cognition. Excuse me, when you view it under different conditions, known as object constancy. It doesn't quite matter if you see it at this point of the field or at that point of your visual field, or if it's larger or smaller or rotated, you can still recognize, your system must be general enough that you can still recognize an object for being the same object, regardless of whether you're seeing it under slightly different conditions. Now that's on the one hand. On the other hand, you want your system to be specific enough to be able to recognize two different instances of the same kind of object. So you want your system to be general enough to tell that those first three pictures were all the same goat, even though you were seeing them under different viewing conditions. Whereas the last image, it is the same kind of object. It still is a goat, but it happens to have a different identity. It's a different goat. Now, how exactly our minds achieve object recognition is a matter of debate. And there are several theories that try to address this. One type of theory is known as the template matching model. The idea is that we have stored in our minds a number of templates of patterns of stuff we might encounter in the world. And the way in which we recognize an object is by comparing it and matching it to a pattern stored in our mind. So in the little example here, we might see this pattern right here. And then this one just happens to match point by point the template of the letter K. And therefore we say, okay, so what we're seeing out here is a K. If you want an example of this, you could imagine that you're walking somewhere, suddenly this pattern of this sensory pattern reaches your retina, it gets processed, it gets turned into a coherent object. And then what you do is you run through all the patterns you have in your mind until you find the right one. So for example, when you see this, you might go, okay, let me try the first pattern. Nope, not that one. No match, not that one. Second pattern. Nope, not that one. Third pattern. No, not that one. And eventually you go through all the patterns until eventually you stumble on the right one and say, oh, that's what it is. It's a cat. But it's fairly easy to see how this particular approach would easily break. You can see if what you're doing is you're comparing point by point the stimulation that comes in to the template. It's not a very flexible approach. It would suffice that your stimulation is just slightly rotated, for example, with respect to the template, for the two not to match and for you to be unable to recognize the object. So in our little example, if you saw a cat, in fact, if you saw the exact same cat, but just walking the other way, or if the cat were, who knows, climbing up, then under this theory, you'd be unable to recognize it. Similarly, you can easily imagine how all of these images here, even though they don't match except for the first one and maybe the fourth one, even though they don't match point by point, the template, it's very clear to you that these are all Ks. And in fact, we typically don't have too much problem reading people's handwriting, and everybody has a slightly different way of doing each of these letters. So in our little example, the problem would be that if this thing suddenly shows up, you wouldn't be able to recognize it as a cat. And so these type of theories, even though sort of appealing in the sense fairly simple, they do tend to be fairly inflexible. You might posit, well, you know what, for every template, we actually store in our mind every possible rotation and every possible viewpoint and every possible scaling factor. But the truth is that this would eventually lead to a possible infinity of templates for every single object that you'd have to store in your mind. So that cannot be the case.